words are a lamp unto our feet and a light unto our path. May that light shine brightly as we read from the Holy Scriptures and seek the wisdom found within. Amen. Okay, before I read, one of the difficulties of following the lectionary is that every week there's several readings. And in theory, I could try and use all of those together to find some kind of through line, but then I don't feel like I can deal with any one of them with enough depth. So I pick one. And some weeks, I look at the readings and I'm like, none of these are really striking me as something all that meaningful to bring forward right now. So I try to figure out what I can do with it. This week was the opposite problem. I wanted to do a sermon on all three of the readings, and I couldn't. So I picked one, and I started doing a sermon on it, and I said, no, we're not going to do that one. So that turned into our call to worship, that reading from James. And then I started on a second reading from Mark, and I'm like, no. They've heard this from me enough times. So that ended up fitting into the prayer of confession. So I settled on a reading from Song of Solomon, because I'm guessing we have probably not heard a lot of sermons out of Song of Solomon. It is a fairly uncommon book to preach from, and I figured I'm going to take the opportunity to do something that people probably haven't heard too terribly many times. So, we are going to look at Song of Solomon. I only wrote 2:8, but it's supposed to be 2:8 until 17, the end of that piece. And warning in advance for you all, and if anyone watches this later, we're definitely trudging deep into the PG-13 territory on this one, because the Bible has stuff in it that is serious subject matter at times. So, we'll read, and then I'll kind of explain what's going on, and then I will make you all deeply uncomfortable. So, chapter 2, starting at verse 8. The voice of my beloved, look, he comes leaping upon the mountains, bounding over the hills. My beloved is like a gazelle or a young stag. Look, there he stands behind our wall, gazing in at the windows, looking through the lattice. My beloved speaks and says to me, arise, my love, my fair one, and come away. For now the winter is past. The rain is over and gone. The flowers appear on the earth. The time of singing has come, and the voice of the turtle dove is heard in our land. The fig tree puts forth its figs, and the vines are in blossom. They give forth fragrance. Arise, my love, my fair one, and come away. O my dove, in the cleft of the rock, in the covert of the cliff, let me see your face. Let me hear your voice. For your voice is sweet and your face is lovely. Catch us the foxes, the little foxes that ruin the vineyards, for our vineyards are in blossom. My beloved is mine, and I am his. He pastures his flock among the lilies until the day breathes and the shadows flee. Turn, my beloved, be like a gazelle or a young stag on the cleft mountains. That's really tame, by the way, as far as Song of Solomon goes. If you have ever taken the time to read through this book, what Song of Solomon is, or if you read other translations, it's sometimes called Song of Songs, or the title keeps changing. This is a collection of erotic poetry in Hebrew that is placed here in the Bible just between, Ecclesiastes and the prophet Isaiah. And some of it doesn't sound too bad because a lot gets lost in translation because it's poetry. It's poetry. And I just want one real great easy example of that here is at the very end, the cleft of the mountains. I should really point out that in Hebrew, the word for mountain is the same as the word for breasts. So that is additionally fun when you think one of the common titles for God is God of the Mountains. And so there's a lot of innuendo and double entendre in Hebrew that just gets lost in translation. But we have here chapter after chapter of very erotic poetry in Scripture. Isn't that fun? We don't read this in church often enough for some reason. So there's four sort of approaches that people take to Song of Solomon, trying to figure out why we have a bunch of spicy poetry here in the Bible. The first one, the kind of original interpretation that was provided by Jewish scholars, is that this is supposed to be sort of a love song between God and people of Israel, right? This is an allegory of God's love for his people and the people's love in return for God. That transitioned into the kind of second reading used by the early church, right? Which is, no, this is Jesus in the church. Same concept, right? This kind of loving allegory between Jesus and the church, or even individual souls in sort of a way. So the allegory ones are historically what's been used for interpreting it. In terms of just why the text is in here, there's a third option that fits really well with last week's, which is to say a lot of this might have genuinely been part of divine liturgies in Israel and Judah before a certain point. Because we see this all over Egypt in the Near East, where you have very, very sexualized liturgies about the relationships between the gods, or between the gods and people in some cases. If you're familiar with Greek mythology, there's a lot of that. So there's that. The fourth option, and probably the most likely one, if we're really going to be honest with ourselves, is that this was just regular, secular love poetry that was written, and the documents just ended up getting bundled up and collected with a bunch of other stuff. And when they were compiling all the texts they had, they're like, well, we have this, let's put it in. And they decided to make an allegory of it. This type of poetry, erotic poetry, is very common in the ancient world. They did not have our sensibilities about sexuality at all, because it is all over in the ancient world. It is extremely public. And in particular, in Egypt, there was a lot of secular erotic poetry, and we have copies of lengthy poems that people wrote in great detail about their escapades. And given how long the Israelites were connected with Egypt, it's not that weird to think that cultural tradition rubbed off. That was a bad, that was inherited that direction. It also, however, going back, fits very, very well with, lost my train of thought, sorry. Also Greek, right? So after Egypt, they went to Babylon. Babylon is where you get much more of the liturgical use of this stuff. And then you briefly have Persia, and then, right, they come in and they get the Greeks. Greeks wrote a whole lot of erotic literature as well. This is in a world where only a small percentage of the population can read, right? We have Greek texts that we've dug up from all over on all kinds of different mediums, and they're divided roughly into thirds. When scholars sit down and read through and translate stuff that we dig up from ancient Greece, it's in thirds. 1/3 is like correspondence and business notes and just your regular kind of day-to-day stuff. And about 1/3 of it is what might be called academic literature, stuff about religious literature or philosophical treatises or things like that. And about 1/3 of it is pornographic novels. It is. This is what they dedicated almost 1/3 of their writing to. This is the world that this comes out of. So it really shouldn't be that weird to us that it's in here. We just over centuries have developed a very different way to think about it. Now, as I said, Israel and Judah was situated kind of in the region of Canaan and then Mesopotamia, right? That's what was around them. They dealt with Egypt a lot, but oh man. I'm going to read to you some bits and pieces from sacred liturgies in the ancient world of the surrounding people, the people they were immediately adjacent to, okay? And these are not secular poems. These are things that would have been recited in their worship services, okay? I'm really trying to, I'm going to leave one for the end and decide if I actually want to go that far or not. So, sacred liturgies. For as long as you live, this is the gods talking to each other, by the way. This is Dumuzid or Dumuzi and Inanna, two gods from Mesopotamia talking to each other. For as long as you live, you shall take an oath for me, brother of the countryside. For as long as you live, you shall take this oath that you will not touch another. Here we go. Here's a good one. I shared this with some of my single friends, so they have some ideas for compliments to give when they're out and about. Maiden, glossy mane, lovely beauty Inanna. Maiden, mane of an ibex, red deer. Maiden, colorful as a pile of grain, fit for a king. Inanna, colorful as the grain fit for Dumuzid. Maiden, you are a shock of 2-row barley, fully developed in loveliness. Then there's a long piece of her referring to her husband as her milk and cream. Okay, so I'm going to leave that one off. Okay. For future reference, if anybody's watching this in the future, because I know it gets posted, you might want to skip a few seconds, all right? This is legitimate, holy writing recited in holy places in Mesopotamia. He is mounting on the back of his sister and making her sing out. If he is mounting on her back and making her sing out, what it is, he is filling her genitals with his ejaculated semen. My brother to me come derisively and mount, who will cause me to have in the future? Right? This is their psalms. This is normal in the ancient world. Okay? Public nudity, discussion of sex, all of this stuff, super normal in the ancient world. They were part of springtime fertility rituals in particular. They'd come out and they'd do all of these readings and stuff, often along times with having sacred orgies. Like, that was a legit normal religious practice. In Egypt, there was a whole 3-day festival where everybody just drank and got naked. In Mesopotamia, this was their religious practice, okay? It was part of wedding liturgies and things like that. They just did not have our sensitivities to the topics of sexuality. And it strikes me as odd sometimes that we in the modern world are completely fine with even graphic depictions of violence, right? We don't have a problem with violence for whatever reason. But sexuality, when it gets mentioned, just immediately sets people up, makes people uncomfortable. We have kind of carved this out and pushed it aside. And I find that fascinating that killing people is sort of just an accepted thing, but loving people makes us really uncomfortable, right? I mean, oh no, people love each other. How dare they? To be fair, Hebrew, the Jewish attitudes towards sexuality, as far back as we can record at least, were always a little bit more guarded than some of their surrounding civilizations. That was just kind of normal. They already had that. And then we get into into Christian history, which started off as apocalyptic. When the New Testament was being written, Paul in particular seems really convinced the world is about to end. So there isn't really need for sex, there isn't really need for long-term relationships or having children, because the world's about to end. That's all a distraction, right? That is his position. He doesn't say it's evil. He says, it's better to not get married or do anything, but it's not evil. If you need to do it, go ahead and do it. But it hasn't ended yet. So clearly that sort of impetus of we don't need to think about this because there's more pressing concerns, that was not quite headed in the right direction. And it got more intense as time went on with people like Tertullian, if you're familiar. Tertullian was one of the first early church fathers to argue for the celibacy of the priesthood, right? We're going to like 160 AD now. This is 1800 years ago plus, who said that there is a hierarchy and that people who are celibate are higher on the spiritual hierarchy. That goes back to Tertullian. And then you get Augustine of Hippo, St. Augustine. He was another popular one. That's another couple hundred years later. And his whole position is that original sin, the thing that first separates us from God, is transferred in the act of sex. That is how we transfer it generation to generation. And so the early church, just from these particular couple of thinkers, picked up this really negative feelings over something that is all over the place. We've talked about some stories that deal with it. This is a normal, expected part of the human experience, and it just sort of got pushed to the side by some of these particular thinkers that became popular for one reason or another. I don't think that was probably the direction we should have gone. I think we have done a disservice to our history. We continue to do a disservice to ourselves by separating off that aspect of being a living creature and just pretending that it sits in this box and we don't need to talk about it or deal with it or acknowledge that it is a normal part of our experience. And there's no reason that it shouldn't be here. Now, I'm not saying we read some of this stuff in church. I'm not saying we go necessarily full tilt and use the Dumuzi Inanna stuff from Mesopotamia. But the Bible is full of sex. It's all over the place in there. And the fact that part of me choosing to do Song of Songs today is the fact that the lectionary actively cuts out so many of the more intense sexual scenes because people are so uncomfortable with it. And we've lost something if we're unwilling to touch that. We have. In the ancient world, most families lived in one big room. Whole extended families. People learned about sex at the same time they learned they were going to have a sibling, right? Because your parents were right over there. That was it. We have just carved this off and pushed it aside so far. It is something that should be celebrated as part of our human experience in life. In the early church, there were bishops reading out of Song of Solomon to the congregations who would dress in bridal gowns, right? To acknowledge like their role as the bride of Christ. There is early church bishops writing erotic poetry about Jesus. It exists, it is out there. It's very strange to read. This book, Song of Songs, is the single most copied book of the medieval era. Monks in their monasteries were copying this more than just about anything else. we need to acknowledge it's there. We need to be able to discuss it and create an ethic on it and figure this out in a new way. Because thousands of years of sort of pushing it aside and being too uncomfortable to deal with it collectively as adults has created problems. And now we're trying to handle it in a society where those controls are sort of backing off, which isn't bad, but we've stopped trying to contribute then to the conversation about, well, if we're not going to have all of these old super restrictive lines that we made up a long time ago because Tertullian was uncomfortable with something, then we need to figure out where the boundaries are now. We need to be part of that conversation. And if we ignore all the parts in the Bible that talk about it, except a couple of points that say don't talk about it, we're not helping. We're not helping ourselves. We're not helping the world. I guess what it comes down to is that whether you want to read this as allegory of God's love for us, or God's love for Israel, or Jesus' love for individually or souls that he has saved, regardless of how you want to deal with this, we have to deal with it. You have to encounter it and read it and acknowledge it. And create space for love to be celebrated in reasonable ways. Because we are physical, biological beings, and that is part of our existence. Or if nothing else, you got some really beautiful things to say to your people that you love, right? You can call them a shock of 2-row barley. I'm sure they will love that. We're all adults. There is a conversation to be had. There are lessons to be learned. We just got to acknowledge it's there. Amen.